Science is facing a crisis. It has provided a foundation for the betterment of human beings, yet it is widely rejected as a credible source of information and judgment. Distrust of science has many sources, but one that has received too little attention I would label a failure of narrative. It is the failure of scientists, journalists, and educators to describe accurately the results of scientific investigations and the knowledge they produce. Put differently, scientists, journalists, and educators don't do a very good job of describing what science actually is. And, in their zeal to communicate, researchers themselves sometimes abuse the scientific process. As a result, it's easy to misconstrue science as a collection of purported facts, many of which turn out to be false, and this leaves people with no good reason to trust the conclusions of scientific studies. I'm worried, too, that the pandemic has made an already bad situation even worse. I'm going to describe this problem, and I'm going to say what we have to do to solve it. Like many other human endeavors, science is built on storytelling. The aim of science is to explain how things work. Scientific stories almost always blend results with speculation. But while they're offering explanations, these narratives should be clear about the strength of evidence and the resulting state of knowledge. Our notions of what constitutes an explanation are intimately connected with causation. And even though there's no comprehensive rule book, no set of algorithms that can determine accurately what we mean by these words, there exist some very important guidelines. Guidelines that, if followed consistently, would greatly improve the quality and ultimately the stature of science. I'm going to step through an example, a scientific article, which I've chosen partly because it illustrates what I want to say, but also because, in many ways, this is an excellent paper and it was published in a top journal. Yet, the authors abuse the scientific process by failing to separate clearly their findings from their speculative explanations. The article I'm focusing on as an interesting exemplar of a very widespread and troubling phenomenon is called Modular Segregation of Structural Brain Networks Supports the Development of Executive Function in Youth. It's a brilliant title that makes a simple, declarative statement. However, as you think about it, this seems like something that would be pretty hard to know definitively. The thing whose evolution and development these authors want to explain is executive function, an umbrella term based on a metaphor suggesting perhaps there's an executive in your brain that's in charge and tells all the rest of your brain what to do. Of course, the metaphor is not to be taken literally, and it has proven to be a valuable concept. It is implemented as a composite score from various components of a neurocognitive test that's administered to subjects in the study. Evaluations that try to measure such things as ability to control attention, ability to shift tasks, and the capacity of working memory, that is, the short-term memory that's used for routine cognitive functions. Importantly, children tend to do better on these tests as they get older, so the scores improve with age. This is depicted by the upward arrow next to the words executive function in the cartoon shown here, which is similar to one the authors provided in the summary of their paper. The arrow labeled neurodevelopment refers to changes in the brain as children get older. Structural brain networks are defined by an indirect measure of white matter tracks, white matter as opposed to gray matter, which are involved in relatively long communication within and across regions of the brain, or what they call modules, shown as shaded regions that each contain many specific parts of the brain depicted as dots or nodes. Modular segregation is the tendency as children get older for this kind of white matter connectivity to increase within brain areas or modules and decrease across modules, as depicted by connecting lines that are thicker within modules than across modules. The results in the paper show that their measure of executive function increases with both age and a measure of modular segregation. My view is that this is interesting and nicely accomplished. In this sense, it's a good paper. The difficulty and I will explain this in a bit more detail, is that the author's analysis does not justify the explanatory story in the title, which states that increased modular segregation in some way leads to enhanced executive function. They say it supports development of executive function, and this message in the title is consistent with what the authors claim in their discussion of results. As I said, scientific stories almost always blend results with speculation. But in this case, inadequate attention to the strength of evidence and the resulting state of knowledge gives readers a very wrong impression. This is what I'm calling a failure of narrative. That is, a failure of scientific storytelling. The source of the problem here is an inevitable mismatch between the words or concepts and the mathematics that get used in data analysis. Concepts are often ambiguous, while mathematics is precise. I call this the problem of ambiguity in data analysis. Vague concepts can be made precise in more than one way. One of the first things statistics students are exposed to is the distinction between median and mean. For example, in 2010, the median household income in Pittsburgh was $42,000, but because a comparatively small number of households have large incomes, the mean was $65,000. In basic statistics, median and mean are often presented primarily to discuss what is usually called central tendency among a bunch of numbers. But it also illustrates the deep and important point that a vague general idea can be made precise in different ways. Another of my favorite illustrations of this is the concept of information. In engineering and computational neuroscience, the term information almost always refers to what is more properly called mutual information or Shannon information. And it's used a lot in statistics where Fisher information is closely related. The general idea behind Shannon information is that information reduces uncertainty. A variable x contains information about a variable y if knowing the value of x reduces the uncertainty of y. This is a pretty good way to understand what we should mean by information. But squared correlation can also quantify reduction of uncertainty. So information as reduction of uncertainty is ambiguous. There's more than one way to instantiate it. The discipline of statistics is keenly aware of the many-to-one mapping of mathematical instantiations to their corresponding vague concepts. Now that I've said what I mean by ambiguity, I want to turn to the most important method in statistics, regression. I say it's the most important method because historically it led to the idea of statistical models. It has turned out to be extremely general. When we include special cases such as analysis of variance, it is apparently the most widely applied method, and in applications, it is tied closely to explanation. The example I used to introduce regression in this book I wrote, with the invaluable help of my colleagues Uri Eden and Emery Brown, comes from a 1939 paper concerning the velocity of action potential propagation in axons of neurons. In this figure, based on neurons of varying diameters, velocity is being plotted against diameter, and aside from relatively small fluctuations in the data, the relationship follows a line. The line was fitted to the data using regression. We usually say we are examining the relationship of a variable y, here velocity, to a variable x, diameter. Now, with a pair of variables, x and y, nearly everyone, at least nearly every scientist, seems to remember that correlation does not imply causation. However, when we introduce an additional variable, w, a remarkable thing happens. In common verbiage, regression examines the relationship of y to x while controlling for w. Or, for emphasis, regression examines the relationship of y to x even after controlling for w. This can be very useful. There must be thousands of interesting scientific applications of regression where the relationship of one variable to another is examined while controlling for a third variable or for many additional variables. But it is treacherous, and it is at the heart of the difficulties with this paper. The authors used something called mediation analysis, which is a nice method of interpreting multiple regression results, but it assumes a causal relationship. Glossing over that detail, effectively, the authors were saying that executive function increases with modular segregation even after controlling for age. And here, the causal explanation in their argument clearly breaks down, in part because of the problem of ambiguity. Controlling for age is not the same thing as controlling for the stage of a child's development. Not every child follows the same developmental trajectory across time. And other features of brain development, such as synaptic reconfiguration and changes in vasculature and other supporting structure, could contribute substantially to the improvement of executive function. The weakness of the explanatory argument that modular segregation supports executive function results from ambiguity in the concept of development. Features of development that track age imperfectly, in statistical parlance, become confounders for modular segregation. That is, they are unmeasured variables that might better explain in a causal sense improvement in executive function. And simple examples show that even a seemingly small ambiguity can invalidate an explanatory argument. By the way, I should add that it is very difficult to think of any instrumental variable approach that might alleviate the problem in this type of data. The author's analysis didn't provide evidence for the strong statement in their title because it couldn't. It's easy to reimagine measured variables as perfect representations of ambiguous concepts, and this seems to lull investigators into forgetting the distinction between correlation and causality. This kind of ambiguity is an insidious, pernicious, and common difficulty in regression analysis. To make sure my point is clear, let me add that applications involving socioeconomic status, or SES, are especially troublesome. SES is defined differently in different studies, but it is generally a composite variable based on things that are supposed to measure socioeconomic status, such as income, educational attainment, and occupation. Ambiguity is always lurking in regression analyses using SES because income, education, and occupation are specific representations of the vague concept of socioeconomic status. No study can control for all of the conceivable precise definitions of socioeconomic status. So every study runs the danger of omitting the component that really matters. As just one possibility, family wealth could contribute to an outcome in some way, but that is rarely measured. When I searched for even after controlling for socioeconomic status, I found the following. Quote, students with high fitness scored significantly better on math and social studies tests compared with less fit students even after controlling for SES. Even after controlling for SES, students wearing more formal clothing showed stronger inclinations toward abstract processing. These are somewhat amusing examples, but then we get to this. Once students begin school, the black-white test score gap grows, even after controlling for SES. From a statistical perspective, all of these statements are problematic, and the last one runs the risk of suggesting, even as an inadvertent subtext, that the test score gap may somehow be immutable. The simpler and more plausible explanation is that, like adolescent development, socioeconomic status is complicated. Investigators who wish to conduct such analyses should, in my view, stop calling their variable socioeconomic status and instead adopt a terminology that describes more precisely what they actually measured. This is basic statistics. But here's the point. To solve the problem I began with, that exaggerated scientific stories, both in journals and in the popular press, undermine science, we have to correct popular notions of science, which neglect the fundamental process of reasoning from data. Reasoning from data is what statistics is about. The discipline of statistics is not simply a repository of tools and techniques, it also provides a conceptual foundation for scientific investigation. A contemporary understanding of the scientific method must explicitly incorporate statistical thinking, and this would help constrain scientific narratives. Let me finish my lecture by elaborating. Here's a figure from a 2011 paper where I attempted to describe the dominant philosophy of statistics. The only thing that was original about my argument in the paper was supposed to be that no one had previously bothered to write it out. Other statisticians may have minor quibbles with or refinements of what I said in the paper, but no statistician has yet told me I got it all wrong. Also, more recently, the Johns Hopkins statistician Brian Caffo posted a short YouTube video about my paper, in which he agreed with me that all statisticians involved with scientific applications think like this. The figure distinguishes what I've labeled the real world from something I've labeled the theoretical world. Arrows indicate connections. The first point is that theory is different than but connected with data which reside in the real world. The second point is that statistical models are like and connected with scientific models, or theories. Both reside in the theoretical world. The third point is that conclusions straddle the real and theoretical worlds because they are based on data, but are most often about models. Because they're so important in this scheme, I want to say a few more words about models, which returns me to where I started. Scientific narratives try to explain. But explanations based on models have always been judged partly on aesthetic grounds. The best explanations are able to engage readers emotionally by virtue of their power and simplicity. A towering example is the mechanistic description of the way neurons fire, how their action potentials are generated, the Hodgkin-Huxley model, most often depicted in cartoon form as a series of events involving first sodium channels through which sodium ions enter the neuron, and then potassium channels through which potassium ions exit, indicated in part A of this figure. The more complete description involves a set of coupled differential equations, and its success is truly amazing. I like to say that among Nobel Prize-winning accomplishments, this is one of the really good ones. It not only explained the generation of the action potential in a particular type of neuron, it also explained 6 additional related phenomena. It is simple and powerful. It inspires profound feelings of awe in all those who come to appreciate it. It has been replicated and applied in hundreds of studies, and yet, over the past 60 years, as scientists have probed in greater detail, of course, it often needs to be modified. There are many different kinds of neurons with dozens of different ion channels, not just 2, and a lot more is known about ion channels and the way action potentials are generated and propagate. Here's a nice description of what constitutes a good model in neuroscience, though it could apply much more generally. What makes a model good? Clearly, it must be based on biological reality, but modeling necessarily involves an abstraction of that reality. It is important to appreciate that a more detailed model is not necessarily a better model. A simple model that allows us to think about a phenomenon more clearly is more powerful than a model with underlying assumptions and mechanisms that are obscured by complexity. The purpose of modeling is to illuminate, and the ultimate test of a model is not simply that it makes predictions that can be tested experimentally, but whether it leads to better understanding. No matter how detailed, no model can capture all aspects of the phenomenon being studied. As theoretical neuroscientist Idan Segev has said, borrowing from Picasso's description of art, modeling is the lie that reveals the truth. Now, I was struck by that last phrase, modeling is the lie that reveals the truth. Picasso had said, art is the lie that reveals the truth. My broader interpretation is that The abstract world of symbols, including math, words, and paintings, can reveal important aspects of reality, the reality of scientific data or of lived experience. Furthermore, the most profound feelings we get from science or art come not as much from an understanding of specific data or specific behaviors of real people, but rather from our sense that a theory or a novel or a painting can explain so much. However, in statistics, I prefer to replace modeling is the lie that reveals the truth with a famous dictum by the statistician George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I've labeled this the quintessential statistical attitude. It's an important change in emphasis, going from truth to usefulness. And in my 2011 paper, I was led to call the dominant contemporary philosophy I was describing statistical pragmatism. The essential idea is to say models live in the theoretical world and to move from true to useful. This step may seem small, but it represents a profound shift because it tells us why we should believe in science and what it means to believe in science. It does this by revising the description of scientific method and the scientific notion of truth. We should believe in science because it has a special status among subjects of narrative conversation due to the scientific method. My point, though, is that we need to replace the outdated description of scientific method, which is often labeled hypothetico-deductive. If, for example, you look up scientific method in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find a serviceable description that references Bacon and Descartes. Those are 17th century philosophers. But we don't teach 17th century calculus because there's been progress since then. And there's also been progress in understanding the scientific method. However, our contemporary understanding is rarely articulated. I'm going to try to summarize it. The scientific method aims to provide explanatory models or theories by collecting and analyzing data according to protocols so that A, the data provide information about models, B, replication is possible, and C, the models become increasingly accurate. I don't have time to go through this carefully, but I did want to show you a concise statement. And notice, please, that causation is subsumed here by my reference to explanatory models. We say a model or theory, such as the Hodgkin-Huxley model, is true in the sense that it provides an excellent explanation of a particular set of results and can be used to explain future results of a similar type. That is, the truth of a theory is contingent on both our state of knowledge and the purposes to which it will be put. Over time, scientific theories become increasingly accurate in their ability to explain results, including a wider variety of results as they get modified. Importantly, scientific knowledge is always uncertain, as it relies on the procedures of the scientific method. So the sense in which I meant that statistics provides a conceptual foundation for scientific investigation is this. Because statistical thinking provides a direct assault on the problem of connecting the empirical world with the world of theory, it leads us to a better description of scientific knowledge and truth. Because statistical methods can evaluate strength of evidence, narratives well informed by statistics tend to assess the strength of knowledge and identify speculation when it occurs. What lessons should we take away from my discussion? Science and the world as a whole would function better if scientific narratives were informed consistently by statistical thinking. Recognizing this, the scientific community should insist on greater clarity and restraint in discussing results, while self-consciously promoting an accurate view of science. An accurate description of science by scientists, journalists, and educators would protect against corrosion, the kind of corrosion that allows entry to the view of science as a bunch of opinions dressed up as facts. I hope now I've succeeded in transmitting my message that exaggerated claims undermine science by ignoring the scientific method. Thank you for listening.